Imagine a world where the truth isn't shaped by headlines or assumptions, but by deep personal exploration and understanding. What if the most powerful insights about life, peace, and justice came from the most unexpected places? Today, we dive into a journey of discovery, one where an Israeli scholar uncovers truths about Islam that have the power to transform how we view the world, ourselves, and each other. And it's not just a story of religion, it's a story of humanity, wisdom, and the profound impact of opening our hearts to something new. Stay with me, because this journey will change you. When people think of scholars who dive deeply into Islamic studies, they usually picture Muslim theologians, Arabic historians, or Middle Eastern academics. So when an Israeli scholar emerges, not only studying Islam, but illuminating its beauty, depth, and wisdom, it creates a powerful moment of intellectual disruption. This isn't about conversion or religious endorsement. It's about the courage to seek truth across boundaries most people avoid crossing. Israel and many Islamic countries have had decades of political tension. The narrative in mainstream discourse often emphasizes division, fear, and suspicion between these two worlds. So, when someone from the heart of that conflict chooses to explore Islam not as an enemy, but as a system of knowledge, a civilization, and a spiritual tradition, it forces a shift in perception. It shows the pursuit of truth doesn't care about borders. This scholar's journey into Islam wasn't shallow. He learned Arabic, immersed himself in classical texts, engaged with the Quran not just as a religious book, but as a philosophical and linguistic masterpiece. He studied the life of Prophet Muhammad not to critique, but to understand. And in doing so, he uncovered a version of Islam that most outsiders never get to see, a religion of nuance, intellectualism, and deeply rooted ethics. This kind of exploration isn't just academic, it's human. It reflects what happens when someone dares to challenge inherited biases and digs beneath the headlines. The scholar's insights didn't come from missionary zeal or a desire to prove a point, but from honest curiosity. That curiosity led to revelations about Islam's inner workings, values, and its place in the broader story of humanity. His work became a bridge, not because he intended it, but because truth has a way of connecting people in ways politics never can. Islam is one of the most practiced religions in the world, yet it remains one of the most misunderstood, especially in Western societies. Most people encounter Islam through filtered narratives, news flashes, political debates, or sensational headlines. In these glimpses often focus on conflict, extremism, or cultural clashes, leaving out the core spiritual, moral, and intellectual essence of the faith. What the Israeli scholar uncovered were truths hidden in plain sight, buried under centuries of prejudice and selective storytelling. One of the first things he realized was how Islam places immense value on knowledge. The very first word revealed in the Quran was a read. Not obey, not a fight, but a read. This highlights the foundational importance of learning and understanding in Islamic thought. It struck the scholar as profound that a religion so deeply tied to submission to God began with a command to engage the intellect. He also found that Islam's legal and ethical systems are more intricate than most people assume. Far from being rigid or archaic, Islamic law, when studied in its original context, is a living system built on justice, mercy, and flexibility. He saw how the Prophet Muhammad emphasized forgiveness, how compassion was a recurring theme in Scripture, and how social justice was not a modern invention, but a centuries-old priority in Islamic governance. Even concepts like jihad were revealed to be far more complex. The inner struggle for self-mastery, the greater jihad, was rarely mentioned in public discussions, yet it was central in classical Islamic thought. The scholar discovered stories of tolerance, coexistence, and mutual respect between Muslims and people of other faiths throughout history. These layers of understanding, hidden behind stereotypes and fear, reshaped the scholar's perception of Islam. It was no longer a foreign ideology, it was a vast ocean of wisdom that most had never been taught to swim in. One of the most powerful realizations the Israeli scholar came to during his study of Islam was the deep, often overlooked connection between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. These three faiths, often portrayed as opposites or even adversaries, actually share a single spiritual ancestry rooted in the figure of Abraham. This common heritage isn't just symbolic, it's theological, historical, and deeply embedded in the sacred texts and traditions of all three religions. Amen. The Quran refers to Jews and Christians as people of the book, a term that immediately sets a tone of respect and recognition. It acknowledges that these communities received divine revelation long before the Prophet Muhammad, and that their prophets, Moses, Jesus, David, and others, are honored in Islam. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad is presented not as a founder of a new religion, but as a restorer of the monotheistic message preached by earlier prophets. The scholar found it striking that many stories in the Quran about figures like Abraham, Joseph, Moses, and Jesus mirror or complement those found in the Torah and the Bible. These aren't foreign characters in the Islamic tradition. They are foundational. The ethical teachings, belief in one God, the importance of charity, justice, patience, and humility run like threads through all three traditions. He also observed that Islamic law and Jewish law, particularly in their classical forms, share structural similarities. Both legal systems are rooted in divine commandments, interpreted by scholars and applied to everyday life. The dietary laws, ritual practices, and even some prayers show clear parallels. By recognizing these shared roots, the scholar began to see the three religions not as separate trees, but as branches of the same trunk. This understanding opened new doors to interfaith respect, highlighting that the divisions between these faiths are often more political than spiritual. As the Israeli scholar delved into Islamic texts and history, one of the most surprising discoveries was the multifaceted legacy of Prophet Muhammad. He had expected to find a political figure, perhaps a military leader, or even a lawgiver. What he found instead was a man of profound compassion, vision, and wisdom, whose life was intricately shaped by a desire to uplift the human condition. The Prophet Muhammad did not begin his mission with armies or laws. He began it by calling for justice, mercy, and faith. Living in a society where tribal loyalty often outweighed moral responsibility, he preached unity under one God, not to divide, but to dissolve the inequalities that fractured his community. The scholar noted how the prophet's early followers were largely from the marginalized, slaves, the poor, and women, people drawn to a message of dignity and equality. Women's rights, in particular, stood out. At a time when female infanticide was common, Muhammad condemned the practice outright. He established legal rights for women in marriage, inheritance, and education, reforms that were radical for 7th century Arabia. The scholar was struck by the prophet's emotional intelligence and personal relationships, especially the respect and partnership he maintained with his wife, Khadijah, and the affection he showed his daughter, Fatima. Education was another cornerstone of his legacy. Muhammad encouraged his followers to seek knowledge even if it be in China, emphasizing that the pursuit of understanding was a sacred duty for all believers. His commitment to justice also shaped the early Muslim community's legal and social structures, with a strong emphasis on fairness, forgiveness, and the welfare of orphans, widows, and the poor. The Prophet's life, as revealed through unbiased study, unfolded as a model of leadership grounded not in domination, but in humility, service, and deep moral clarity. One of the most eye-opening aspects of the Israeli scholar's research into Islam was his study of the Quran's references to the natural world. While the Quran is primarily a book of spiritual and moral guidance, it also contains verses that describe aspects of the universe, life, and nature, with a level of insight that the scholar found deeply intriguing. These were not scientific manuals, but reflections that aligned with certain discoveries in modern science, centuries before those discoveries were made. The Quran speaks of the development of the human embryo in stages, a process described in remarkable detail at a time when no microscopes existed. It describes the protective layers of the atmosphere, the expansion of the universe, the origins of life from water, and the balance in nature, all ideas that have parallels in contemporary scientific understanding. The scholar, coming from a background steeped in critical thinking and academic skepticism, was struck by the consistency of these themes across different surahs. What fascinated him was not just the content of these verses, but the tone in which they were presented. They were not dogmatic claims, but calls to reflection, Verses like it, do they not look at the sky above them, or we will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves, encouraged believers to observe, think, and understand the world as a way to appreciate the Creator. The scholar noted that this integration of faith and reason challenged the common narrative that religion is anti-science. Instead, he found that the Quran inspired scientific curiosity and presented the universe as a sign-filled book meant to be studied. For him, these verses didn't prove the Quran scientifically, but they did reveal a worldview where science and spirituality walked side by side. During his exploration of Islamic history, the Israeli scholar was deeply impacted by the realization that Islam played a critical role in shaping global civilization. Far from the narrow portrayals of a static or regressive tradition, he found a rich heritage of innovation, intellectualism, and cultural sophistication that spanned centuries and continents. This was especially true during what is now called the Islamic Golden Age, a period roughly between the 8th and 14th centuries. At a time when much of Europe was engulfed in the Dark Ages, Muslim scholars were building libraries, translating ancient texts, and pioneering advances in fields ranging from mathematics to medicine. The scholar was astonished to learn that algebra itself comes from the Arabic word al-jabr and was formalized by the Persian mathematician al-Khwarizmi. Hospitals as institutions of healing and research were developed in Muslim lands with systems of medical ethics and treatment that would later influence European medicine. He also discovered that Islamic civilization preserved and expanded upon Greek, Roman, Persian, and Indian knowledge. Scholars in Baghdad's House of Wisdom translated works by Aristotle and Plato, but they didn't stop there. They critiqued, refined, and built on those ideas. Muslim scientists like Ibn al-Haytham developed early theories of optics, while philosophers like Averroes and Avicenna shaped both Islamic and Western thought. Art, architecture, astronomy, agriculture, and even finance were areas where Islamic societies thrived. Cities like Cordoba, Cairo, and Damascus were centers of learning and tolerance, where Muslims, Jews, and Christians coexisted and contributed to a shared intellectual culture. For the scholar, this history shattered the illusion that Islam was a mere spiritual force. It revealed a civilization that had once led the world in knowledge, creativity, and progress, deeply rooted in its faith, yet outward-looking and transformative in every sense. One of the most profound insights the Israeli scholar gained from his study of Islam was the understanding of how deeply the religion cultivates inner peace and personal discipline. While the external aspects of Islam, prayer times, fasting, and rituals, are often viewed as rigid or demanding by outsiders, he came to see them not as burdens, but as tools for inner transformation. They weren't just about obedience. They were about harmony between the soul, body, and mind. Daily prayer, performed 5 times a day, stood out as a rhythmic anchor in the life of a believer. To the scholar, this wasn't just religious formality. It was a moment of pause in a chaotic world, a structured reminder to reconnect with a higher purpose. The act of bowing and prostrating carried a quiet humility, training the ego to surrender, not to another human being, but to the divine. Fasting during Ramadan fascinated him even more. On the surface, it appeared to be about abstaining from food and drink. But what he discovered was a spiritual detox, an invitation to reflect, purify intentions, and strengthen self-control. It built empathy by placing the individual in the shoes of the hungry and the poor. It reminded people that discipline was not a punishment, but a path to clarity. Zakat, or almsgiving, showed how Islam channels wealth as a spiritual responsibility, not just a social obligation. Even pilgrimage, the Hajj, represented more than a journey. It was a stripping away of status, ego, and distraction. These practices, studied in their full context, revealed a comprehensive framework for living with purpose. The scholar recognized that Islam wasn't just about belief. It was about cultivating a state of being. A state where discipline didn't confine the soul, it liberated it, creating space for calm, awareness, and balance in a restless world. The Israeli scholar quickly realized that much of what the world thinks it knows about Islam is shaped by distortion, fear, and selective storytelling. In the media, Islam is often associated with extremism, violence, or oppression, and those narrow images become the lens through which many judge the faith. But as he engaged with original texts, spoke with Muslims, and studied Islamic history, a very different picture began to emerge. He found a religion rooted in peace, the word Islam itself deriving from salam, meaning peace. The Quran repeatedly emphasizes mercy, justice, and kindness, not just toward Muslims, but toward all of humanity. The Prophet Muhammad is referred to as a mercy to the worlds, and countless teachings highlight tolerance, patience, and compassion. Even in matters of conflict or law, the scholar saw nuance and ethical depth often ignored in public discourse. Islam, as he came to understand it, was not a monolith or a threat. It was a sophisticated, deeply spiritual tradition that had been unfairly reduced to its worst representations. This contrast between perception and reality challenged him to question not just how Islam is portrayed, but how easily truth can be buried beneath fear, politics, and ignorance. The Israeli scholar's journey into Islam was not one of religious conversion, but of intellectual and emotional transformation that crossed cultural and spiritual boundaries. Coming from a background where Islam was often viewed through a lens of suspicion or conflict, his deep dive into Islamic teachings marked a shift not only in knowledge, but in perspective. What began as an academic inquiry turned into a humanizing experience that reshaped his understanding of faith, identity, and shared humanity. He immersed himself in Islamic theology, philosophy, and history, often in spaces far removed from his own cultural comfort zone. Yet the more he explored, the more he recognized universal values embedded in the Islamic tradition: compassion, justice, truth-seeking, community, and respect for the divine. These weren't foreign ideas. They were human ideas, articulated in a different language, but echoing the moral teachings of his own heritage. What struck him most was how this process transformed not only how he viewed Islam, but how he viewed himself. By stepping outside his inherited worldview, he was able to reflect on his own traditions with more clarity and humility. It wasn't about replacing one belief system with another. It was about broadening his capacity for empathy and truth. This cross-cultural encounter helped him challenge the deeply ingrained narratives he had grown up with. It also gave him a model for how people of different backgrounds can engage with one another, not through debate or conversion, but through listening and sincere exploration. His respect for Islam deepened not because someone convinced him, but because he chose to look closely and think critically. Through that process, he discovered that real transformation doesn't always require agreement. Sometimes it just requires the courage to learn from the unfamiliar and recognize the sacred in someone else's story. The Israeli scholar's engagement with Islam didn't lead to a formal conversion, but it sparked a profound personal awakening that went far beyond academic curiosity. He had set out with a clear intellectual goal: to study Islam from an outsider's perspective, examining its history, philosophy, and cultural impact. What he didn't anticipate was the spiritual transformation that would accompany his exploration. In his research, he came to understand that Islam, like many religious traditions, was not merely a set of doctrines, but a lived experience that shaped its followers' lives in deep, meaningful ways. The practices of daily prayer, fasting, charity, and pilgrimage were not just rituals. They were tools for self-discipline, spiritual reflection, and a deep connection to the divine. He observed how these practices transformed the lives of Muslims, giving them a sense of purpose, balance, and peace in a chaotic world. But perhaps the most powerful realization was that understanding Islam didn't require him to adopt its beliefs or convert to the religion. It simply required him to approach it with openness, humility, and a willingness to engage deeply. Through this process, he began to notice how many of the values emphasized in Islam — compassion, justice, personal responsibility, and community — were values he had always held dear, even though he had never viewed them through this particular lens. The scholar didn't convert, but his respect for Islam grew immensely. His awakening was not about changing his identity, but expanding it, enriching his life with a broader, more nuanced understanding of the world and the people in it. He realized that true personal transformation comes not from adhering to a single path, but from embracing the wisdom in all paths that lead toward peace and understanding. But perhaps the most powerful realization was that understanding Islam didn't require him to adopt its beliefs or convert to the religion. It simply required him to approach it with openness, humility, and a willingness to engage deeply. Through this process, he began to notice how many of the values emphasized in Islam, compassion, justice, personal responsibility, and community, were values he had always held dear, even though he had never viewed them through this particular lens. The scholar didn't convert, but his respect for Islam grew immensely. His awakening was not about changing his identity, but expanding it, enriching his life with a broader, more nuanced understanding of the world and the people in it. He realized that true personal transformation comes not from adhering to a single path, but from embracing the wisdom in all paths that lead toward peace and understanding. In exploring Islam through the eyes of an Israeli scholar, we uncover a powerful truth: understanding and empathy can bridge the deepest divides. By looking beyond stereotypes and misconceptions, we open ourselves to the richness of a tradition that emphasizes knowledge, peace, justice, and compassion. The scholar's journey is a reminder that true wisdom doesn't come from judgment, but from listening, learning, and growing through shared human experience. Islam, like all great faiths, offers insights that can change our lives for the better by encouraging us to live with purpose, discipline, and empathy for one another. Thank you for your time and attention. I wish you all the best in your own journeys of discovery and understanding. May you continue to seek knowledge, foster compassion, and always remain open to the unseen truths that can transform our lives. Good luck and thank you.